The text that's going to engage us for this morning is the gospel lesson for today from Luke chapter 17, particularly the first part of that, the first 6 verses of that text. Will you open with me today in a word of prayer? Lord, open our hearts to hear through thy word, and to us draw near. Let us thy word in pure retain. Let us thy children and heirs remain. Amen. Jesus often gave his disciples nicknames. Perhaps one of those disciples, Simon, son of Jonah, Andrew's brother, you know better by his nickname, Petros, which when brought in English is Peter. But not only did Jesus give individual disciples nicknames, he also gave collective disciples nicknames. And so to the sons of Zebedee, the brothers James and John, Jesus gave the nickname Boanerges. And not only did he give collective nicknames just to 2 disciples together, but for his whole lot of disciples, all 12 of them gathered together, he had a nickname for all of them. He called them Oligopistoi. Now, when Jesus gives a disciple a nickname, it always has some meaning behind it. And so that name, Boanerges, that he called the sons of Zebedee by, James and John, well, we're told by Mark, in Mark chapter 3, verse 17, that it means sons of thunder. Now, Mark doesn't tell us why Jesus called them the sons of thunder, but if we look in the Gospels, we see some possibilities of why. In fact, our Gospel lesson for today from Luke chapter 17 has some hints a little earlier in the Gospel. If we went to Luke chapter 9, verse 54, we could find that once when Jesus and his disciples were passing through a town of Samaria, the town was less than hospitable. They did not allow Jesus or his disciples to spend the night there. And so these 2 brothers, James and John, came to Jesus, and they said to him, "What, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and consume them?" So maybe it's because of their thunderous personalities that Jesus calls them the sons of thunder. But then Peter seemed to have a thunderous personality too, if you think about him in the Gospels, and that's not what his nickname meant. The name Petros in Greek means rock. And we're told in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, that Jesus specifically gave Peter this name because of the confession of faith that he would voice in the presence of the other disciples, confessing Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus said that confession is a foundation for the faith of the church of all time. But he wasn't commenting on the size of Peter's faith or its strength. We find that out just a few hours before Jesus' crucifixion, when Peter's faith itself falters. And Peter even denies faith in Jesus. So Simon Peter would remind us that the real rock, the real stone, is not him or his faith. But in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 6, he tells us that Jesus is the cornerstone. And all who want a solid faith and a foundation for their faith put their faith in Jesus. And that's why, even though knowing that Peter's faith is going to falter, Jesus still gives Simon this nickname, Peter, and gives it to him long before he ever made that good confession of faith, or long before his pitiful denial. Jesus actually gave him that nickname. Did you know this? The first day he met Jesus. That's what John tells us in John 1:42. Jesus said, "You will be called Peter." Okay, so if the names that Jesus gives to his disciples have meanings, what about this collective name for all of his disciples, that he calls them Oligopistoi? What does that mean? Well, before I simply translate that for you into English, let's look at the different episodes in Scripture in which Jesus uses this for his disciples, and then you tell me what you think it means. So Jesus' disciples follow him and leave everything behind to do so. The 12 of them went with Jesus and traveled all over during his mission or ministry. Jesus told another would-be disciple in this Gospel of Luke, told him in Luke chapter 9, verse 58, that foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And apparently that was enough to keep that wannabe disciple from following Jesus, but not these 12. These 12 followed him anyway. And oftentimes it meant they didn't know where they were going to lay their head. It meant they weren't sure where they were going to secure their next meal from. And Jesus could tell this bothered them. They had suffered from the same kind of anxieties as the rest of the crowds that followed Jesus. They wondered about food, and about clothes, and about possessions, and about money, and about what's going to happen tomorrow. So in Luke chapter 12, verses 27 and 28, Jesus said to them, "Consider the lilies of the field. They neither labor nor spin. And yet I tell you that even Solomon in all his splendor was not arrayed as one of these. And if God so clothes the grass of the field that is alive today, and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, how much more will he clothe you, Oligopistoi?" On another occasion, all 12 of these disciples are with Jesus in a boat. And they're together with him. 5 of these disciples are seasoned fishermen, which means they're rugged seafarers, and they're at home at the sea, whether at night or day, no matter the weather. But it just so happens that day, a furious storm came up, and no matter what maneuvers they tried to do with that boat, they could not stop the waves from swamping it. And so they called out to Jesus, who happened to be sleeping very peacefully in the stern, and they said, even the most rugged of them, "Lord, save us!" And when Jesus spoke, the first thing he did was address those 12 disciples, and he said to them, "Oligopistoi, why are you afraid?" And then he turned his address to the wind and the waves. And the words of Psalm 107, verse 29, he made the waters still, and the waves hushed before him. There was another occasion where all 12 of the disciples were with Jesus, and they were in a boat. This time it was at night, and one of those rugged seafaring fishermen saw Jesus coming out to them walking on the choppy waves, and had courage enough to step out of the boat and walk out with Jesus at Jesus' invitation. And even though his nickname meant rock, he didn't sink like one, at least not initially, not until the choppy waves that were hitting him swamped his courage, and then he started to sink. But he called out to Jesus and said, "Lord, save me." And Jesus, we are told, looked at him, took him by the hand, and said to him, "Oligopistoi, why did you doubt?" On yet another occasion, when these disciples are together in a boat and heading to the other side of the sea, they arrived at the other side of the sea, and when they got there, they remembered they didn't take any bread with them. And the scriptures tell us they were discussing this among themselves. And you know how those discussions go. "What? We don't have any bread? You were supposed to bring the bread. You were supposed to bring the bread. He was supposed to bring the bread." They're doing it all in hushed tones because they didn't want Jesus to know what they were talking about. But you can't keep secrets from an all-knowing God. And so Jesus, the scriptures say, being aware of what they were talking about, addressed them and said, "Oligopistoi, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000? And how many basketfuls were left over?" Okay, I've given you about 5 episodes where Jesus addressed his disciples with this nickname, Oligopistoi. What does it mean? Well, if you've been looking at the sermon text and title, you saw it there, didn't you? In English, it's little faith ones. Or as the way our Bibles translate it often, "O you of little faith." Now, when Jesus says that to his disciples, is he chastising them about the size of their faith? Is he criticizing them, saying that their faith should be bigger? See, I used to read these texts in that way. I often have read these texts in that way. And actually, I think that's the way the disciples understood it too. That's why in our text for today, in Luke chapter 17, these disciples, when they're faced with a challenge of Jesus that's greater than bread or waves, when they're faced with the challenge of addressing sin head on and with forgiveness, they say to Jesus, "Lord, increase our faith." Verse 5 of chapter 17. Increase our faith. they're looking for Jesus to give them more faith because they recognize that it's hard to forgive. Jesus said this. He said at the beginning of our lesson, back to verse 1, temptations to sin are sure to come. But woe to the one through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were tied around his neck and he were cast into the sea. Pay attention to yourselves. If your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times in the day and turns to you 7 times and says, I repent, you must forgive him. It's hard to address sin head on. It's much easier if somebody sins against us just to keep it inside and secretly be angry with them. It's much more difficult to confront that, and even more difficult than confronting it, to do it with an attitude of forgiveness. But Jesus not only encouraged his disciples to be ready to forgive, but he says, if this happens to you 7 times in the same day of the same sin, be ready to forgive. As long as your brother is contrite, as long as your sister is contrite, be ready to forgive. That's hard to do. And so the disciples said, Lord, increase our faith. It's not that they wanted to get a new nickname. I mean, they didn't care if they were called heroes of the faith or pillars of the faith. But they were kind of tired of being called those of little faith. They just wanted to have enough. Give us enough faith. Give us enough faith for when we don't think we have enough, whether it's enough bread or enough clothes. Give us enough faith to deal with the storms of life when they come and we feel like we're sinking. Give us enough faith. Give us enough faith to deal with the opportunities for forgiveness when they rise before us. Just give us enough. And we with the disciples say the same. Lord, increase our faith. How good are you at offering forgiveness when somebody hurts you? How good are you at offering repeated forgiveness when the sin happens over and over again? See, I think with the disciples, we end up saying the same thing. We say things to ourselves like, if I just had enough faith. Or the flip side, I just don't have enough faith. And so with the disciples, we cry out the same thing. Lord, increase our faith. But it'd be good for us to hear how Jesus replied to these oligopistoi, these little faith ones, when they asked him to increase their faith. Jesus said to them, and this is our text for today, Luke 17, verse 6, if you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted into the sea, and it would obey you. Now, I don't know a lot about mulberry trees, but I do know there was one in the news recently. It's a mulberry tree that sits on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., alongside the Washington Monument. And it has stood there for well over 100 years. It has graced photos and newsreels. It has witnessed the history of this nation. So the Women's Suffrage March of 1913, the I Have a Dream speech of 1963, this mulberry tree was there for all of it. Except that this May, it was uprooted. Now, I don't think that was a disciple of Jesus practicing his control over nature. Unless he got distracted in the middle of it, kind of like Peter walking on the water, and it didn't really work, because it did uproot and then plant into the sea. It just kind of stopped. But the funny thing about it is that the National Park Service found so much historical value in that tree, they decided instead of just cutting it down and cleaning it up and replanting a new mulberry tree, they spent 2 weeks trying to raise the tree again. And then when they did get it raised, the next night, the wind blew, it came right back down. The news report, though, says that that tree is now standing, although not quite as straight up as it used to. It's got a little lean to it, and it is permanently now held in place by engineered supports. And the cost of the heavy machinery to lift that tree, and the arborists, and the operators for the machinery, and the engineers to design the supports, $22,000. Now, listening to the words of Jesus for today, it might seem ridiculous, but Jesus says that one of his disciples could have done that, in moments with nothing but faith, and done it for free. But a news story like that makes me think about what Jesus said here and think, Jesus, this is kind of ridiculous. I'm not sure I can believe this. That if it costs that much to raise a mulberry tree from horizontal to vertical, that you're saying a believer in you could just, by faith, pick one up and have it moved into the heart of the sea? Lord, if you really want me to believe that, you're going to need to increase my faith. But to say that falls into the same faith faux pas that Jesus' disciples had. The faith faux pas that sees their faith as being too small. The faith faux pas that says that the bigger the faith, the better the faith. That's what the disciples were thinking. But Jesus said if you had faith like a mustard seed, you could say to this tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. As of yet, the disciples still saw this label that Jesus gave them, this nickname, oligopistoi, as a criticism on the size of their faith. And they didn't see anything positive in it. They were tired of being called little faith ones. When I was young, I grew up in a time when Life cereal had advertisements on television that ran constantly. And the advertisement went something like this. There's a family full of kids, and mom bought a new kind of ice cream, bought a new kind of cereal for them, Life cereal. And the kids were tentative about trying it out. So what they decided to do was make their littlest brother eat it, and his name was Michael. And they had him be the sacrificial lamb for the family. But then as they poured him a bowl and he started eating it, they were all excited and amazed because Mikey likes it. And so that's the big thing with the commercial. I grew up with the name Michael, which meant that it seemed like every week somebody was quoting that to me. Every time I sat down for lunch in elementary school and took a bite of my sandwich, there was somebody at some table that wasn't mine who was near me who said, Mikey likes it. I did not like being called Mikey. Mikey is a diminutive. It's something that you call little kids, not something that you call an aspiring young man, which I thought of myself as being even when I was in elementary school. I did not like being called Mikey. Now, I'm not young anymore. But I do have someone in my life who calls me Mikey. Or something like that. My brother-in-law, Leo Sanchez, was out here in the Northwest, actually in Spokane, just a couple weeks ago. He's a professor at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, and he came out on church business to lead the pastors in the North Idaho, Washington, Oregon area in some continuing education. And I had the opportunity to be there. It was a great chance for me to see my brother-in-law, who I don't get to see very often. He's married to my sister. And because I have a relationship with him, I was the one who was arranging his travel and all the logistics on behalf of the other pastors in the region. And even though this was official church communications that were going back and forth between he and I, he addressed each of the emails to me, Miguelito, which my brother-in-law is Latin American. And in Spanish, that is the way you say Mikey. Because ito is what you put on the end of a word when end of a name when you're talking to a child. And so it's like a Y in English. Except that it doesn't bother me when my brother-in-law calls me Miguelito. I actually appreciate it. I appreciate it because I see it as a sign of the relationship that I have with him. And I respect my brother-in-law. And I love him. And so when he calls me Miguelito, I appreciate it because it speaks of the closeness of our relationship. Well, these disciples in Luke 17 had not yet recognized that when Jesus calls them oligopistoi, he is not criticizing their faith, but he is expressing the closeness of his relationship with them and their relationship to him. You see, because it doesn't matter the size of faith that you have. It matters who your faith is in and the relationship you have with that person. And so it's not about having a great faith, it's about having a faith in a great God, in Jesus. Because there is no storm in life that Jesus can't still. There's no crowd so large that he can't feed them. There are no waters so choppy that he can't walk them. And there is no sin too deep, too hurtful, too fresh, too painful, that he can't heal it with his forgiveness. And that's why he tells his disciples that they should be ready to forgive. Remember what Jesus said to those disciples who thought they didn't have enough bread? And Jesus said, remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls were left over? And so when we struggle to forgive, Jesus would say to us, remember my death and resurrection? How much forgiveness I won and how much was left over? There was enough forgiveness through his death and resurrection to forgive the faltering faith of even Peter, the so-called rock. There was enough forgiveness won at the cross to forgive every one of his 12 disciples, and enough left over to forgive every one of your and my sins. Indeed, there are basketfuls left over for us to carry around and then pass out to others when the opportunity arises. There is plenty of forgiveness. You think that moving a mulberry tree is a significant event? Jesus moved a mountain in his death and resurrection. Mountain of sin. Psalm chapter 103 verse 12 says, as far as east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions. He moved a mountain of our transgressions, just as the Lord Jesus fulfilled the Psalms of Psalm 107:29, which said that he would still the storm and hush the waves. So also he fulfilled this Psalm, Psalm 103 verse 12, by removing that mountain of sin from us. And he tells his disciples, his little faith ones, that they are able to do that too. You see, this is the other saying of Jesus, very similar to the one we have for today. If you had faith, even that like a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and moved into the sea, and it would obey you. Jesus also said, this is Luke 17, in Matthew chapter 17, that if you had faith like a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it would obey you. Nothing would be impossible for you. There in Matthew chapter 17, when Jesus said that to his disciples, is because there was a man who came to them with a son to be healed. It came to the disciples first. The disciples were not able to heal him. And then the man went to Jesus and said, I took my boy to your disciples, and they weren't able to heal him. And then Jesus immediately heals him. And the disciples are scratching their heads about this. And later they took Jesus aside privately and they said, why were we not able to do it? Why were we not able to do it? Why were we not able to do it? Jesus said to them, because of your little faith. For if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it would obey you, and nothing would be impossible for you. Because of your little faith, Jesus said. And now before you get out your measuring line and start sizing your faith again, Jesus is not saying because your faith is so small. He's talking about relationship, isn't he? Because this is how little faith works. Little faith can't do anything on its own. Little faith can only do things in relationship with Jesus. John chapter 15, verses 4 to 5, Jesus would say, abide in me, and I will abide in you. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Little faith can only accomplish great things, and nothing is impossible for little faith if it's lived out in relationship with Jesus. That's what it means to be able to move mulberry trees and mountains. The Apostle Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, I can do all things. Wait a minute. I didn't get that right, now did I? He said a little bit more than that. Philippians 4:13, he said, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Allopistoi, you can face all the challenges of this life, even the big challenges of sin and forgiveness, through him who strengthens you. In Jesus' name.